Hey everybody, welcome to Philosophy 1000. I'm Professor Daniel Cunningham, and I'll be communicating with you throughout this summer semester through these little online video lectures. I'm going to keep these relatively informal. There's nothing terribly strict about these. I'm just going to kind of talk through some things as they come up throughout the semester. So the first topic for today, starting off the class here, what is philosophy? Natural question to begin with, especially since most people come into college without any academic exposure to philosophy. There's usually not much opportunity to take it in high school, so you're probably pretty new to it. So what is it? Not as straightforward a question to answer as you might think. Of course, there's the kind of cliched answer that you've maybe heard. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. Right? People say that because of the etymology of the word, right? Philo, Sophia, love of wisdom. But that's kind of a cop-out. It doesn't really tell us that much. It's not very useful. So I'm going to try to answer that question a little elliptically, but over the course of three short topics here. First, I want to talk about philosophy as a historical phenomenon, how it came to be. Then I want to talk about it as a principle of scientific inquiry, which is what it was for a very long time. Because you might know that the kind of modern divisions of the academic departments that we have in the university now have a history of their own. A lot of them have only existed since maybe the 19th century. A lot of them are newer than that even. But for a lot of its history, philosophy was considered science. So that's something I want to talk about a little bit as well here today. But lastly, I want to talk about what I think is the more useful way of looking at it for us, which is philosophy as a perspective of inquiry. So first, philosophy and its early history. We're going to start our readings in this class with Plato, but Plato is not the first philosopher by any means. The philosophers that come before him are, well, there's Socrates, who we're going to meet through the lens of Plato, but even before Socrates there are a number of Greek philosophers known as the pre-Socratics. Thales is the man who is usually referred to as the first philosopher. We don't know a terrible amount about what he thought. Most of these guys, we don't know very much about what they thought because their texts have been destroyed over time. So we have little fragments, we have things preserved by later philosophers, especially Aristotle. But people like Thales, Parmenides, Heraclitus, Empedocles, these are big names from the pre-Socratic era, starting in the 7th and 6th centuries BC in Greece. Right? I'm not going to get into a lot of depth about the content of pre-Socratic thought, but what I think distinguishes it and makes it philosophy rather than whatever came before is probably the perspective of universality, the perspective of trying to establish truths about nature for all time and respecting nature in itself. Right, nature in itself, rather than trying to understand natural phenomena for the sake of some human purpose, like commerce or like navigation. One of the very few sciences that's older than philosophy, interestingly, is astronomy. The ancient Egyptians had very advanced astronomy. The ancient Babylonians had very advanced astronomy. Astronomy goes back a really long way. Why is that? In large part because navigation was very important for early societies, branching out and trading more, becoming more advanced. Those kind of earliest great societies needed to trade a lot over water distances, over the sea. So they pretty early on learned how to use the stars for those navigation purposes. And with that came some sort of theoretical knowledge about astronomy, but that wasn't the point. Where philosophy really emerges, I think, is where thinkers start to try to establish things about nature just in itself, just the truth of nature in itself, by itself, for itself. So to explain just a little bit what I mean by that, you're probably familiar with the old earth, wind, fire, water distinction, right? Maybe you know that that's something that some of the ancient Greeks believed for a long time were kind of the basic elements. Sometimes scientists refer to these kind of in an analogy to our modern periodic table of elements, right? The four basic pieces. That's usually attributed to a philosopher named Empedocles, who came up with that distinction. But think a little abstractly about what exactly he's trying to do there. He didn't want to divide the universe into earth, water, wind, and fire because that would help him to get to a trading location, or help him to calculate what someone owed him or something like this, some kind of practical purpose like that. He's really just trying to establish what are the most basic facts about the universe. What is nature really made of at its most basic, at its most fundamental? What are the elements of reality? That's what that question answers, however incompletely. Obviously it's a different time in terms of technology and in terms of the development of human mind itself. But that's a pretty radical shift in perspective to look at things just for their own sake. And that, I think, early on is what establishes philosophy as an independent avenue of inquiry, as an independent discipline, right? Along those lines as well, so philosophy, for most of its history, you can say, is an attempt to establish universal truths. That's what Empedocles was trying to do with the four elements. That's what Aristotle's trying to do, Plato's trying to do, etc., to establish eternal truths. And in general, there's a sense in which philosophers tend to want to rise above particular experiences and phenomena, and to derive broader, more general, abstract theories from those particular experiences. I say that with hesitation, because even that isn't completely true, and there are legitimate philosophical positions that emphasize the particular, that emphasize the empirical. There are even philosophers who have made claims like there are no universal truths, or have made claims like the only constant in the universe is change, and so it makes no sense to even look for final principles or the elements of everything, or something like that. Right? So these are not, it's not an entirely uncontroversial position, but in a general sense, philosophy is concerned with the abstract, the theoretical, the universal. That leads me into the last point, and what I think is the most useful way for us to think about what philosophy is as a possible perspective on anything. Right? So a lot has changed over the course of history, and in fact one of the reasons that it's difficult to pin down what exactly philosophy is just the fact that it's so old. Right? I said it's not as old as astronomy, it's not as old as mathematics, but it's older than every form of science, every other form of science. It's older than almost all of the academic disciplines that you know. I mean, in fact, most of the academic disciplines that we have now have kind of derived evolutionarily from philosophy, as things have sort of branched out into more particular focuses that intellectuals take. So now at this point, and for our purposes, I think it's best to think of philosophy as a potential perspective on anything, which asks more abstract and theoretical questions about anything, but it isn't necessarily confined to whatever particular area of study you might be more focused on. So for example, what's the difference between philosophy of science and practicing science? What's the difference between a philosopher who deals with the status of science and a scientist, him or herself? First of all, philosophy of science is a really big area of philosophy, especially these days. It's very important right now. A philosopher of science would not be concerned with trying to fill out all of the places on the periodic table of elements, or trying to find a cure for cancer. Any of these things, trying to determine shifting climate patterns and predictive models for things like that. Those things are the concerns of scientists. The concern of a philosopher of science would be, what is the place of science in society? What purpose does science serve? How much validity and necessity do we ascribe to scientific truths? Are scientific truths more valuable than other kinds of truths? Is there a relativity to scientific truth, or are scientific truths universal? These are all abstract questions that are bound up with any scientific endeavor, but that a scientist, him or herself, doesn't need to ask to do his or her job. Right? You could say similar things about anything that you're interested in, philosophy of art, right? Which is also called aesthetics. I listed the 5 kind of usual major branches of philosophy on your philosophical vocabulary lexicon that I hope you've started looking at. But that's not it. It does break down a lot more minutely than that. Philosophy of science, aesthetics, like I've mentioned, philosophy of economics or business, right? Philosophy of history is what my personal specialty is. along with political philosophy. So, philosophy, I think, is a kind of perspective, a different way of looking at anything that I hope I can encourage you to take both into your own studies in other areas, assuming that you're not a philosophy major. Maybe some of you are, and that's great, and we can talk about that. But I hope that it can come to inform and make you more critical, more discerning, more abstractly thinking, or more critically thinking about the things, the specific endeavors that you are involved in, careers that you're looking at getting into. But also, it offers the same kind of shift of perspective and critical perspective on just your personal life, your place in society, your place as a political actor, the state of society, all these things that also impact your life and our lives, but that might not be strictly a professional matter or an academic matter. That's a fair amount to think about at the outset here. I am going to try to keep these lectures fairly short, so I'm going to call it there, and I'll talk to you again soon.